Hey guys, keep on coming in. All right, let's get our little chat going here. See who we've got today. Awesome. All right, just quick check. Can you guys hear me? Okay, awesome. Well, I know Adam can hear me. Thank you, Adam. We will assume that means everybody. I guess if you can't hear me, you wouldn't know to say no. All right, so a couple of things. First of all, first aid stuff. I think most of you, if not all of you that are on this list, yeah, when I look at this list here, yeah, you guys have handed in all your first aid stuff, so you're good. And I think you've all written your first aid exam, so you're good for that. So that's perfect. There is a heart quiz. Now, not everyone has completed the heart quiz. I haven't checked to see who on this list hasn't completed it, but that quiz was supposed to be done today at noon. I've extended it till midnight tonight. So make sure if you haven't done that, that you get that done. That's on Moodle. So that is that. All right. Also, a couple of things. We have a 4-day weekend coming up. So there will be no classes on the Friday and no classes on the Monday. So we'll meet again on Wednesday. But I do have a worksheet for you that will be due on Monday, but you'll get that today. So you can probably get it done by the end of the day tomorrow, and then you don't have to worry about it for your Easter weekend. Okay, so I think that was all that I needed to mention on my little list here. So let's continue on. We're going to start talking about blood today. So today we're going to focus on the different components that make up the blood. And then on Wednesday's class, we will talk about how to blood type. So what blood typing means. So type A, B, O, and AB. And then on after that, we'll probably be writing a little worksheet and then a quiz shortly after that on this blood type or blood and blood vessel section. All right. So that being said, I'll open up the PowerPoint on blood and we'll continue with that. So there is some strategies. I did post it so you can print it out and have a copy so you can actually read a paper copy if that works for you. Some of you work better with a digital copy. It's all there. It's posted if that's helpful to you. Okay. All right. So let us move on. So I will just share this with you. And there we are. Okay, and then we'll just open up the chat here. Just give me a quick yes if you can see this PowerPoint. Okay, good. I will assume that everyone can see it with my answers there. And I'll just get my pen open here. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to look at blood and the different components of blood. So those of you that are in Bio 20, this will be a bit of a review of stuff you've already heard. So is a new word part for us, and that means red. Okay, so erythro means red. So erythro, red, cyte means cell, so red cell or red blood cell. So that's what that means. Okay, leuco means white. So a leukocyte, white cell or white blood cell. Okay, and then cyte, we learned about this way back in our very first module, HSS 1010. And cyte means cell. So thrombocyte, we talked about thrombo in the blood vessel booklet. What does thrombo mean? Who can remember that? Someone's got to remember that. Thrombo. No one? thrombo means clot. So a thrombocyte is a cell or a part of a cell that is responsible for clotting blood. Okay, so that's where that word comes from. Okay, so what's blood for? There's a few things we use our blood for. So one thing that we've talked about quite a lot in this unit is transportation. So blood is used for transporting nutrients and wastes, including gases, right? What two gases have we talked about that are transported through the blood? Okay, type out a gas that's transported through the blood that we've been talking about. Really, guys? All right. So the gases in our blood that are being transported are carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay. Yes. Thanks, Aiden. So carbon dioxide and oxygen. And nutrients, things like glucose, right? The energy that our cell needs, wastes. Well, carbon dioxide is one of the cell waste products, but there's lots of others. One is urea, for example. Okay. Protecting the body from pathogens. So pathogens are disease-causing organisms. So we have part of the makeup of our blood is a protection mechanism. Okay. And forming blood clots, right? So if we have a cut, a clot will form so we don't lose all of our blood. Okay. All right, so if we take a look at this image, what this does is this gives us sort of a breakdown of blood. So up here, this part here, this is like our whole blood. Okay, that's everything we have, that 100%. So if we cut our arm, that's what's coming out. Okay. But we can divvy that up into two parts. So one part of that is referred to as our formed elements. So these are all the cells or parts of cells. And the other part is the plasma. So the plasma is the liquid part of our blood. So plasma is mostly water, but it's not clear like water. It's sort of a straw color, and we'll see an image of that a little bit later. Okay, and that makes up the majority. The formed elements, that's the great big pieces. So there's our red blood cells, our platelets, and our white blood cells, where the plasma is where things are dissolved. So we have gases dissolved in there, we've got proteins in there, we've got hormones in there. So all sorts of stuff's moving around in the plasma. Okay. If we were to donate blood, you can donate whole blood, okay, that whole bit. So whatever they pull out of your arm, you donate. And I believe it's something like 70 days. Every 70 days, you can donate blood. But you could also donate plasma. And I think that's something like every 3 days you can donate your plasma. Okay, so it's a very different standard, but that means they're filtering all of this stuff out. All that stuff is staying in your blood vessel. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at these components here. So our formed elements. So the first one is our erythrocytes. So that's the fancy word for red blood cells that you need to know. You need to know that fancy word. There is leukocytes. Okay, so you need to know that word as well, white blood cells. And then platelets. Okay. Our plasma, that's the liquid portion of our blood. So remember, that's mostly water. And then that carries stuff in it. So proteins, nutrients, there's some dissolved oxygen in it, there's some dissolved carbon dioxide in it. So all sorts of stuff is carried through our plasma. Okay. All right. So what I like about this image is this one, we can see a little bit about how these little test tubes are made. So very often when we talk about blood, we can see the layers like this. But I liked the idea that this image showed us a device that's called a centrifuge. So a long, long time ago when I used to work in a lab, I would use a centrifuge quite often. So what's happening here is some blood's been taken from this person. So this is whole blood that's been taken. So this is everything, right? This is the plasma, the red blood cells, white blood cells, everything dissolved in the plasma, platelets, all of that stuff, okay? So all of that is in here. And then that goes, sorry guys, I just want to see who's just joined us here. Okay. And then that we put into this device called a centrifuge. And basically what it does is it spins the test tube super, super fast. And everything that's heavy is drawn to the bottom and the lighter stuff floats on top. So we get the layers of things based on their density. So here on the bottom, we see that our red blood cells make up the bottom of this test tube. And those are the erythrocytes. So that's approximately 45% of our blood is red blood cells. The next layer we see is a term called buffy coat. That is not a term you have to memorize. And that's made up of our white blood cells, the leukocytes, and the platelets. So that's 1 or less percent of our whole blood. And then 55%, this is like the watery part of our blood, the plasma that's floating on top. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is just look at what the main functions are of our 3 formed elements. Okay. So the first one we see here is erythrocyte. So the red blood cells. Their big job is to transport oxygen. Now, can they transport carbon dioxide? They do to some degree, not like they transport oxygen. Okay. Most carbon dioxide actually transports in the plasma, but most oxygen is transported by red blood cells. Our white blood cells, their big job, they're our fighter cells. They're the ones that fight against infection. Okay. And then our platelets are thrombocytes. So these are fragments of cells and they play a role in our clotting of our blood. So if we didn't have platelets, our blood wouldn't clot. Okay. All right. So our formed elements, those are the cells or parts of cells. So these guys are all produced in the bone marrow of our bones. And we'll talk more about bone marrow when we get into our musculoskeletal system, which is our next unit. But that's the bone marrow, okay? And cells and cell fragments are produced there. So those are our formed elements. So when we take a look at the image on the right-hand side here, first we see the red blood cell. Now, a red blood cell, we can't see colors with this. This is a kind of a cool image. This is taken through what's called a scanning electron microscope. So if you have taken the microscope unit in Science 10, you would have learned about these. They allow us to see pictures of teeny tiny things in 3D. So if I look at this red blood cell, it kind of looks like a disc with a little divot in the middle. It's sort of like someone took a tire and shrink wrapped it. Okay, so we don't see the hole in the tire, but we have this little divot. So these little guys are super important for carrying oxygen around our body. We see here, this is one type of white blood cell. So we have 5 different types of white blood cells, but this is one. And we can see that the white blood cell is bigger than the red blood cell, right? But we have way more red blood cells than we do white blood cells. And then here we see the platelets, and they're teeny tiny, okay? They're little tiny parts of cells. And they play, like I said, a role in clotting our blood. Okay. All right. So here we have this little image here. So let's look up here at this first point, and I'd like you to tell me, what are we looking at? What is this pointing at? Let's see if we can get some participation from some of you now. What are we pointed at? Type it in your phone or your computer, whatever you're working on. Come on, you guys. Thank you, Cora. This leukocytes, okay? So these are our white blood cells or leukocytes. You need to know both of those names, and I can see them here, okay? All right, now let's look at the next one, okay? So someone type in, what are we looking at in this next image? Okay, what are these guys? They're one of our formed elements. These are platelets, okay? So they're small because they're parts of cells, okay? And then lastly, the last arrow, Erythrocytes, these are our red blood cells. So if we take a look at the blood going through this blood vessel, right, we see there's lots of red blood cells, right, which makes sense because that's 44 to 45% of our blood. Don't see as many white blood cells, okay, and these are all different versions of white blood cells. And then over here, little teeny tiny platelets. All right, red blood cells. So red blood cells, 44 to 45% of our blood volume are red blood cells. They're disc shaped, right? So we can see with the discs here. They lack a nucleus. And what I like about this little cartoon that I found here is we can see this red blood cell taking in oxygen, right? So we have to remember it's taking in oxygen at the lungs, and then it's delivering that oxygen to our body cells, right? So in the pulmonary circuit, they're taking in oxygen, and then in the systemic circuit, oxygen's going to the cells. A couple of interesting things about our erythrocytes. They have a lifespan of only 120 days. Okay, so these guys live for about 4 months and then they die. Now that doesn't mean our body stops being able to produce or being able to carry oxygen. That's not true, because they just regenerate. So they're produced in our bone marrow, but they don't have a nucleus, so they can't they can't copy themselves. So cell division can't happen with red blood cells. There was a thought process around 100 years ago, and that process was, or that thinking was, if we could take someone young, so maybe someone your age, and take your blood and put your blood into someone older, maybe your grandparents, then they would be young again. Interesting thought, but it was wrong. And the reason it was wrong is because we all, regardless of whether we're talking about you, your parents, or your grandparents, our red blood cells are all the same age. They're 120 days, okay? Because we regenerate them every 4 months or so, all right? Okay, next. All right, next, we just are going to look at the different parts of the red blood cell. So red blood cells can transport oxygen because they have a particular protein called hemoglobin, okay? So hemoglobin, that's a really, really critical protein, hemoglobin. And what we're looking at in this image here, okay, so, oops. In this image here, we see these little pink dots. And those little pink dots are referred to, or these are the hemoglobin. So those are little proteins that are on the red blood cell. And then oxygen coming from our lungs. So here's the exchange. These red blood cells would be in our capillaries, and this would be in our lungs. And the oxygen's coming and it's going to attach to these hemoglobin. And here we see the hemoglobin with oxygen. And then during the systemic circuit, okay, when the cells are collecting oxygen from the red blood cells, that oxygen's leaving the hemoglobin. Okay, so hemoglobin is really important for that process. So most of the oxygen that's transported in our bodies is transported on hemoglobin, which is on our red blood cells. Okay, now in order to make hemoglobin, we need iron. Okay, so iron is required to make this protein called hemoglobin. So if we don't have iron, we can't make hemoglobin. Okay, so you may or may not have heard of a condition called anemia. So anemia basically means that if we directly translate it, our blood is lacking. But really what it means is we don't have the ability to transport oxygen to our cells. And there's 3 reasons why that could happen. Okay, so reason number 1 could be that we don't have enough erythrocytes. Okay, so we don't have enough erythrocytes to move the oxygen to where it needs to go. Another reason we could suffer from anemia could be we don't have enough hemoglobin. Okay, so there's not enough hemoglobin to attach. And the third reason could be we don't have enough iron, because if we don't have iron, we can't build hemoglobin. Okay, so you might hear of people who are anemic because they're iron deficient and they have to take excess iron in order to deal with that. That's so they can build hemoglobin so their bodies can carry the oxygen. Okay, so it binds to the oxygen. Oops, I'm just going to go back for 1 second here. Here's just a little interesting fact about this, though. You guys have probably heard of carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide is that odorless, colorless gas that's deadly. So it's when we run our cars, often carbon dioxide is so carbon monoxide, sorry, is given off as part of our exhaust. If our furnace isn't running properly, carbon monoxide can be released into our homes. Carbon monoxide is deadly. And the reason why it's deadly is that it actually hangs on to the hemoglobin here much tighter than oxygen. So oxygen hangs on, the hemoglobin hangs on to the oxygen, but when it gets to the cells, it lets go of the oxygen and then hangs on to it again at the lungs, but lets go at the cells. Carbon monoxide and hemoglobin just bond like this. And what that means is it bonds so tightly that oxygen can't get on. And that's why people with carbon monoxide poisoning are likely to die, because now our cells are completely deprived of oxygen. And if our brain's deprived of oxygen, we can't function, right? So that's what carbon monoxide poisoning is all about. Okay, at the bottom of this page here, I have a link. We're not going to watch this together. It's about a minute long. And it just talks a little bit about how hemoglobin works. So I would suggest after this video, if you can go into your notes and just click on that, because the PowerPoint is in your Google Classroom. Okay. All right, now we're talking about leukocytes. Okay, so our white blood cells. All right, so our white blood cells are our fighter cells. So we can see my little cartoon image at the bottom. We've got our white blood cells, and they're fighting the bacteria, which is the pathogen. Okay. If we look at this little image here, we see, again, the difference between the white blood cell and the red blood cell. White blood cell is quite a bit bigger than the red blood cells and has a completely different shape. So these are our fighter cells. So when we have an infection, our white blood cell concentration actually goes up. So I told you when my youngest boy, or oldest boy rather, was 15 months old, he had to get a spinal tap. So they thought he had an infection in his spinal cord area called meningitis. So a spinal tap is basically they take a sample of the fluid right beside your spine and they see if there's white blood cells in there. And if there's white blood cells, then that's a sign that there's an infection. Okay, so we're checking for white blood cells because if we're sick, our concentration of white blood cells goes up. If you have pus is a bunch of dead white blood cells. Okay, and then other liquidy stuff that moves its way out of our blood into our tissue. Okay, all right. So our leukocytes are part of our immune system, right? They help us to fight. They do have a nucleus. They are, like the rest of our formed elements, created in our bone marrow. And they're colorless, okay? So their main function is to fight infection. So when our white blood cells are working and we get sick, that's why we feel sick, okay? That's because our immune system's actually doing what it's supposed to do. So when we get a cough or we get a runny nose, that's all the impact of our immune system doing its job, okay? So that's important to us. White blood cells are bigger than red blood cells, but there's not as many of them, okay? So for every one white blood cell, there's about 700 red blood cells, okay? All right. And our platelets. Okay, so here we see our little platelets. So I made a little cartoon here for you. So platelet party, what's going on here? It's a platelet party. I haven't had this much fun in years. And then they're all stuck together, okay? So we're kind of imagining a blood clot forming there, and that's what's going on with our little platelets. Okay. So these are cell fragments involved in clotting our blood. They don't have nuclei. They're parts of cells, okay? So how do we clot blood? Now, this is a really, really complicated process, clotting blood. Like there's 10 major steps in this process that you do not need to know. We're just going to basic fundamentals. Okay, we get a cut. Now, I said skin is cut, but it could be anything that's cut. So it could be something internally as well, but we get a cut. Okay, and with that cut, a blood vessel has been broken. Okay, so what happens is our platelet
runs through that. Whoops. As the platelet runs through that, it kind of gets
broken open by those rough edges of where that that cut is. And then it spills these chemicals out into the blood vessel. And what happens is these chemicals cause this series of events. Remember I said it's like lots and lots of steps in blood clotting? Eventually what happens is we get this protein produced that kind of forms all of this fiber. And that fiber all forms over the space where this cut is in the blood vessel. And it's got this nice net, and that net will trap our red blood cells. Okay. And we eventually get a blood clot, which is what we want. Okay. So eventually, so we get a blood clot, the blood stops flowing, and then we might get a scab. And we get that scab, and if we pick at that scab, we've actually taken that clot away. Because once we have a clot, not only does our blood stop flowing, that stops any pathogens from getting into that open area and infecting us, because our skin's pretty important to block pathogens from getting inside our body. So if we pick that scab, we've done two things. We've caused that blood to start flowing again, and we've also opened our body up now to infection. Okay, so if we take here at the image on the left, so we see all this fibrous protein, and it's formed a fiber over top of the gap in the blood vessel, and we see all the little red blood cells that have been trapped there. Okay, if we look at the image on the right, what I see here is a blood vessel. And I see the red blood cells, and then these little bits here, those are the platelets. So the platelets are running by this break. We see the red blood cells, they're coming out, right? Our blood's going to be leaving through where that space is, that gap in the blood vessel. The platelets are coming here, and they're getting cut by this rough surface, and they're going to break. And as they break, that series of events happens that leads to this protein. It's called fibrin, but you don't have to know that. This protein being formed, and that protein's trapping those red blood cells as they're trying to leave through this hole, and that's where we get a blood clot. Okay. All right. Okay, plasma. So when we take a look at this image here, and I told you we'd be able to see some real life image of plasma, we see that it's not clear. Okay. It's the liquid part of our blood, but it's straw colored. Down here, we see the erythrocytes, right? That's where our red blood cells, and then this is that buffy coat. That's the mixture between the platelets and the white blood cells. But here's the plasma, okay? So in the chat, I'd just like you to tell me, what's the number one ingredient of plasma? The biggest proportion? What's it mostly made out of? Yes, plasma is mostly water, and then it's got a bunch of stuff dissolved in it, right? But it's mostly water. That's the liquid part of our blood. So we have to remember that. Okay. All right, so the stuff that's in our plasma, so there's stuff that's dissolved in our plasma. So water, number one material dissolved in our plasma, okay? But we have proteins dissolved in our plasma as well. So some of the proteins that matter a lot to us, well, the first one I have here, the antibodies, well, that's pretty important. Antibodies are little proteins that are made by our white blood cells. And basically what they do is antibodies are markers, and they go on the pathogens. And basically it's like a big red light on our pathogens saying, okay, white blood cells, kill it, okay? So that's really what our antibodies do. They're little markers that mark stuff for destruction. And they're floating around. So what they're doing right now, just an interesting side note, talking about antibodies, is with COVID-19, there's people that have recovered. So they were doing an interview with a woman, one of the first people diagnosed in British Columbia, and they're testing her blood for antibodies. Because if they can take those antibodies that are from her blood that have already attacked the COVID and somehow use those to help treat people that are suffering with it. And that's something that they're looking at. It's kind of like what they did in the Outbreak movie. They tried to get antibodies from the monkey that was infected and develop some way to deal with it. Okay, so this is actual research that's happening right now with antibodies formed by people who have already had and recovered from COVID-19. So China's said that they've had some success with that, so hopefully we in Canada will have some as well. Enzymes is another type of protein. Enzymes are proteins that basically help reactions to happen in our body. So when I talked about blood clotting being this 10-step process, right? We have all these steps. Every step involves an enzyme. Okay, so all of those little processes that we have, we need an enzyme to make them happen in our body. All right, so those are proteins. Other things that are in our blood, dissolved gases. So while most of the oxygen in our body is carried by the hemoglobin on the red blood cells, there is some oxygen that's dissolved in our plasma. Carbon dioxide is dissolved in our plasma. Nutrients, okay, glucose is an example of a nutrient that's dissolved in our plasma, and that gets carried and diffused to our blood, or to our cells rather. Amino acids, these guys are basically building blocks to build proteins. So for our body to make a protein, we need amino acids in order to do that. And lipids are fats, okay? All right. Other things that are carried on our plasma, we have electrolytes. Some people like to drink Gatorade because there's lots of electrolytes. It's an expensive way to get electrolytes. Electrolytes are basically, like in Science 10 and Science 9, you learned about ions. They're basically ions that are floating around in our body. And we have to have a certain level of them. Not too much, not too little. Too much can make us sick, too little can make us sick, okay? But these guys are floating around in our body. All right. We have hormones. So hormones usually cause things to happen in our body. So we have, for example, growth hormone. It's a hormone that makes us grow. We have a hormone called thyroxine that helps us to metabolize things, to break stuff down, particularly glucose. We have insulin that reduces the amount of glucose in our blood by telling our cells to take in more glucose. So we have lots and lots of different hormones. Vitamins. So the vitamins we get from our food are going to travel through our blood and go to our cells, and they'll help for certain things to happen. Certain reactions require vitamins. And wastes, right? We have to be able to get rid of waste, so there's traveling through our plasma as well. Okay, and drugs. So we can test the amount of drugs that we have in our body, or if you're taking a particular drug, that drug can travel through our blood to go to different parts of our body, okay, in order for our cells to have access to it. Okay. All right, I do have a couple videos linked here. These are on the components of the blood, so I would recommend watching them. They're not very long. I don't think any of them are over 5 minutes. So if you can watch those on your own, just to help you clinch what you need to know about the blood. And then we'll do the different blood types next class. All right, any questions on what we talked about today? All right, so I'm just going to take a look at our worksheet that I've assigned. All right, there we are. All right, so this worksheet I assigned for you guys. This is due on Monday, but like I said, you could probably finish it before the end of the day tomorrow. And this just goes through what we've talked about so far in both the blood vessel lecture as well as this first part of the blood lecture, okay? As far as doing these sheets, you can do them in two ways. So you can either, because some of you I think have been having some difficulties trying to type, especially if you're trying to do this on your phone. You can either type right on the worksheet if that works easiest for you, or you can read the worksheet on your device and then just write the answers down. You do not have to write the questions down. Just say question 1, answer question 2, and then whatever your answer is, okay? And you just need to write the answers down and then just take a picture of your answers, okay? Either one works for me. I want it just to be easiest for you. So whatever works easiest for you is the way that I want you to do this, okay? All right, guys, any questions? Okay, so unless you come to one of my classes or one of my open office hours, I guess I won't see you guys until after your Easter break. So try to have some fun during your Easter break. And yeah, I guess we will see you next Wednesday. Bye, guys.